everybody can hear what's going on, right? We got our audio video crew with us. We're studying about the book of Proverbs. So we're not studying the book of Proverbs yet. We're still introducing the author at this point as far as that goes. So if you go to Proverbs chapter 1 and verse 1, then we just started with the Proverbs of Solomon, the son of David, king of Israel. So last week, as we introduced the idea of who Solomon was, we went back and looked at some of the history of David and Bathsheba and how they came together and became a family, right? And some of the things that happened, even though they shouldn't have happened, those are facts, aren't they? And so we looked at some of those things as we introduced the topic. And so we're on the second page. Some of you that don't have an outline yet are getting it. And so at C, that's kind of what we're discussing between C and D. David and Bathsheba's second son. And so when you go to 2 Samuel 12, verses 24 and 25, it says, Then David comforted Bathsheba, his wife, and went into her, lay with her. So she bore a son, and he called his name Solomon. Now the Lord loved him, and he sent word by the hand of Nathan the prophet, so that he called his name Jedediah because of the Lord. And so there's several things that we think about this. We talk about Solomon. Solomon's older brother died, didn't he? And do you remember we discussed some of the reasons that he would not have been able to be king? You remember that? Okay, we talked about because of the relationship that David and Bathsheba had, he would have been rejected by the Jews and by going into the temple. And the job of Solomon's son was to build the temple. That was a promise he made. And so when you go and you look at verse 24, it said that now the Lord loved him. Does that mean that he did not love Solomon's older brother? No, that's not what it's talking about. But God was going to use Solomon. He was the right person for the right job, right? And so Solomon was going to be used as an instrument for God to build the temple. And so God loves everyone, and he loved Solomon also. And so we see two names here. And so when you look at one under C, we see Solomon means what? Peaceful, right? And in this, which we really haven't, we're still going to introduce some more regarding the book other than just the author. But when you look at this paragraph, he said he was probably born about 1035. Okay? And so you look at that, and there's some verse references here. And he succeeded his father on the throne in early manhood, probably about 16 or 18 years of age. And Nathan, to whom his education was entrusted, called him Jedediah, which means what? If you're reading along, it means beloved of the Lord. And so when you look at verse 24 of what we just read in 2 Samuel 12, we see that God did what? Love Solomon. Okay. And so we mentioned that. So as we come down to D, we see that Solomon almost lost the throne. And the reason I put this paragraph in here was because you look at the age. Do we know exactly the age that Solomon was? Some kings we do, don't we? But we do know that Solomon was younger. And so if you put him at 16 or 18 years of age, when we think about that age category, are they capable of being king? There's some question in our minds, isn't there? And so as you go on to 1 Kings chapter 1, and so we're jumping ahead, and when you look, the outline says verses 5 through 40. We're kind of going to look at some key verses. But if you go back to verse 1, we see now King David was old, he was advanced in years, and they put covers on him, but he could not get warm. And so what do we know about David? He was feeble. In his condition, was David able to be king? Was he king? He was the king, but was he being king? Keep that in mind as we go on and we look at verses 5 through 40. And so we see verse 1, and there's some quotes here from some commentaries that talk about David's age. And I'd never thought about how feeble of a condition he was in that Israel was really between kings, because they have a man who's very young, who's going to be king, but he's still not the king, and you have David, who's too old to do the job for a king. And I think this might be a good thing to think about, because on Sunday night, I think it came up in Eric's Bible class, talking about elderships, right? And what's one of you talk about an eldership and them being able to do their job. Is there a point when a man isn't elder enough? Yeah. And then there's a point when they're too elder to be an elder, right? And that's important. And I think that probably everybody here has seen congregations that maybe have suffered from an eldership or an elder that was too old to be able to do their job. And Israel's suffering because David was so old. If you look at point number 1 here at the bottom of page 2, it says, stricken in years, about 70 years old, since clothes mean bedclothes. And I thought that was interesting. When you look at the word, that's what it meant. He was bedridden. He wasn't able to go to the throne. He wasn't be able to go out and check on his kingdom. He wasn't able to see what was happening. And so he was relying on reports if he was even able to make any decisions at all. Okay? All right, so when you pass out this, I hope I'm not short. If so, Eric will make copies for us and help us out. All right, so you'll get page 3. And so we looked at verse 1. We're going to jump ahead to verse 8. And so when I put these in our outline, this is the context of what we're talking about. These are the verses that lie around the subject, but for the sake of time, I'm going to try to press forward and depend upon your foreknowledge to relate to the subject we're talking about and go back and review them on your own at home. But in verse 8, so we're in 1 Kings chapter 1 and verse 8, it said, but Zadok the priest, Benaiah the son of Jehoiada, Nathan the prophet, Shimei, Rei, and mighty men who belonged to David were not with Adonijah. And so what we're seeing is we're seeing Solomon's brother who wants to become king. This is a self-appointment, which was easy to do because what was David's condition? He was feeble, right? In fact, when you come to verse 11, it says, so Nathan spoke to Bathsheba, the mother of Solomon, saying, have you not heard that Adonijah, the son of Haggith, has become king, and David our Lord does not know it? So when we think about this, the Bible clearly states to us that David wasn't even aware of what was happening in his kingdom, that there was a new king coming to power. Nathan, right, we're familiar with Nathan because Nathan was the one that came to David, right, and helped to prick David's heart through the illustration that he gave. And so he comes to Bathsheba and asks the question, what? What's the question? Yeah. Spoke to Bathsheba. Have you not heard? Now, I don't know about you, but this is pretty big news, isn't it? Yeah, that too. But when you think about, and I think what we're trying to paint the picture of is, and we're not trying to degrade David in any way, because this was just the situation he was in life because of his age. But the fact of the matter is, he was not being king and couldn't be king. Okay? And so Nathan came as a friend, didn't he? And a spokesman for God to speak to him and try to help the entire nation. Okay? So we come to verse 17, and we see, then she said to him, my Lord, you swore by my Lord, your God, to your maidservant, saying, surely Solomon your son shall reign after me, and he shall sit on my throne. Now, Bathsheba is speaking to David. Why do you think she's speaking to David now? because maybe she didn't know until Nathan got there and said, "Haven't you heard?" So we see how important of a player Nathan is in the salvation of Israel, right? Now, would God make sure his promises came true? Yeah. But we see that this is providentially at this point taking place through Nathan. And Bathsheba are involved. So we come and we look at verse 26, and we see, but he has not invited me, your servant, nor Zadok the priest, nor Benaniah the son of Jehoiada, nor your servant Solomon. And so what are we talking about here? What we're talking about is the key players in David's nation and his royal cabinet were not invited to this inauguration ceremony. Why? Maybe because they knew God promised that he wasn't going to be king. This isn't the only time in Israel's history where you see things like this take place, where only certain individuals that are going to be on my side, which wasn't on God's side, are invited. But we see how things are playing out. We come to verses 29 and 30, and we see the king took an oath and said, now who's the king still? David. He was still in authority, but you see that Nathan and Bathsheba are helping him. There's nothing wrong with this because he needed the help. But they're helping him, but he's still the king. He took an oath and said, as the Lord lives, who has redeemed my life from every distress. You read the book of Psalms? Think about all the distresses that David was spared from. He puts his trust in God. He says, just as I swore to you by the Lord of Israel, saying, assuredly Solomon your son shall be king after me, and he shall sit on my throne in my place. So I certainly will do this day. Then Bathsheba bowed her face to the earth and paid homage to the king and said, let my Lord King David live forever. And so I think this is important, verse 31, and it's not highlighted, so you might pencil it in here. As we progress through the book of Proverbs, we're going to get to the end, and we're going to see Proverbs 31. And Proverbs 31 is the chapter about the virtuous woman, right? And who was the virtuous woman? Do we know? Yeah. Most likely Solomon's writing about his mother, who was Bathsheba. Which is interesting based upon the mistakes that she had made in her past life. We kind of focused on that last week. But did those mistakes in her life define who she was? No. Well, she's a far better person than that. And I think Proverbs 31 shows us that. Okay, that was a glimpse of a terrible time in her life and David's life that she clearly overcame. And so when you look at verse 43, we see, then Jonathan answered and said to Adonijah, no, our Lord King David has made Solomon king. Guess what this self-inaugurated king finds out? Somebody found out about our plan and you're not going to be the king. And so then you look at verse 46. Also Solomon sits on the throne of the kingdom. Solomon is now the king. And then you come to verse 52. We see, then Solomon said, if he proves himself a worthy man, not one hair of him shall fall to the earth, but if wickedness is found in him, he shall die. And so Solomon here puts a condition on whose life? Yeah, Adonijah's. Nobody wants to say that. Don't worry, I had to practice a lot last week to get it out. But anyway, I think this says a lot about Solomon and his patience, right? This is a pretty serious thing for a man to say, hey, I'm going to just take the entire kingdom.
So this Adonijah, whatever his name is, he wasn't even in that lineage of David, right? It was just some other person?
He was
He's David's son.
David's older son.
But a different wife.
Yeah, David had multiple wives. So he had.
Okay, let's not go there.
We started to last week because Justin had a question, and so we tried to answer it
Okay.
well, but yeah. But the difference was he wasn't promised the throne. Like Ishmael. And so, customarily, who would take the throne? The oldest. Over and over again through biblical history, we see for certain reasons the oldest doesn't, right? We had a name mentioned a moment ago. What about Joseph? I thought about this yesterday. We were coming back from funeral, Barb, and we're all visiting in the car, and she said something. I thought about Joseph, right, and the inheritance. His son's got a double portion, but he wasn't the oldest. And so things like that. And so we see God rewards those who need to be rewarded, not always based upon your birth. And that's important. So what I want us to realize as we think about this is Solomon becomes king as he's a young man and he's a teenager. And he wasn't even in the position to get his own throne. His father was too old to realize what was happening just because of his health and his age. And so you have Nathan stepped in, and then his mom stepped in and helped. And we know that it was God's providence, right? And this was the right thing. But Solomon didn't do it himself. David, when he became king, who gave him the kingdom? Same person as God and Saul. God did. But we see it transpiring in a much different way. When we're introduced to David as a young shepherd boy, and then he fights with Goliath, and we didn't go that far back in our history, but we see David as boy David who does a man's job, don't we? But we see Solomon, when it's time for him to be king, his mom and Nathan really have to lay the groundwork so he gets it from his older brother. And that's my perspective whenever I study about Solomon, as we go on to talk about Solomon asking for wisdom. Because other people had to, present him the throne in a way. And I think those events were humbling, and this is my personal opinion, but these events were humbling to him so that he realized that he needed more help to be able to be a good king. Any perspective that people have? Disagreements? Okay. So as we go to David's charge to Solomon, again, we're talking about events that are shaping who Solomon would become. And you come to 1 Kings chapter 2, and you look at the first 4 verses, 1 Kings 2, 1 through 4. It says, "Now the days of David drew near that he should die. And he charged Solomon his son, saying, I go the way of all the earth, be strong therefore, and prove yourself a man." Had Solomon, he's king, isn't he? But in the events that we read about in chapter 1, do we really see Solomon stepping forward and showing the world or the kingdom that he's a man? I don't think so. I really don't. And so David tells himself to show himself a man. And so he says, keep the charge of the Lord your God, walk in his ways, to keep his statutes, his commandments, his judgments, his testimonies, as is written in the law of Moses, that you may prosper in all that you do wherever you turn. And we think about this. The ladies have the Ladies' Day coming up, and you always pick a verse and a theme, right? And I think if we had a Man's Day, that this would be a good verse. Because what we're seeing is David tells Solomon it's time for him to step up and be a man. That's in verse 2. In verse 3, David tells Solomon how to be a man. Now, by today's worldly wisdom, is this the way to become a man? Not even close. He says, keep the charge of the Lord your God, to walk in his ways, to keep his statutes, his commandments, his judgments, and his testimonies, as is it written in the law of Moses for them, that you may prosper in all that you do and wherever you turn. Did Solomon prosper? Why? because he started his life out this way. Now, as things progress along, Solomon became less and less prosperous in different ways because of the decisions he made. But in the beginning, he started strong and hard. You come to verse 4, it says that the Lord may fulfill his word, which he spoke concerning me, saying, if your sons take heed to their way, to walk before me in truth with all their heart and with all their soul, he said, you shall not lack a man on the throne of Israel. You think about the promise that was made to Abraham in Genesis chapter 12, you know. Abraham finally, many years in the future, has a son. Finally has the right son. But did he get to see all that prosperity? No. But he could die in confidence knowing that God had given him a what? A legacy. And so God, and you think about when Solomon became king, I think at his age, and again this is assumption, but based upon the way our lives progress at different stages, I don't think the promise of chapter 4 would have been as important to Solomon. Why? Because I'm the king. We don't know the condition of Solomon when he died, right? There's a lot of discussion we could have about was he faithful or not. We know that there's times in his life that he was. We know that there's times in his life he wasn't. How did he die? Faithful or unfaithful? It's up in the air, right? But you think about the promise of verse 4. And when we get to the end of our life, there's several things we can look forward to. What are they? Our reward in heaven, but also the legacy that we leave behind here, right? The legacy that Solomon would leave was based on what? His faithfulness. So the question I have that I don't know that I can answer, I don't know if we have the answer to on this side of eternity, is did the promises of verse 4 change Solomon's last years? Could have, right? Could have. All right. I don't want to teach Bible class on assumptions, but these are things I think about, right? How these things could impact his life from here all the way forward. Go 2 Chronicles 22. I probably should have broke this up more. We're not going to read all of this, but we're going to hit some highlights here. I have this titled here, David's early charge. In 2 Chronicles 22 is similar to what we looked at in 1 Kings 2 as far as he's giving him instruction. But the focus here, you see David was very spiritually minded. One of the spiritual minded priorities of David was making sure that God had his temple. And so as you look at and I'm in first, let me get there. I'm in Kings still. 2 Chronicles 22. I give you the right, yes, 2 Chronicles 22. 6, beginning. I think that's a typo. Let me get the right place. I didn't go to the right book. 1 Chronicles. I got it right on the next reference for Chronicles. All right, 1 Chronicles 22:6. We see then he called his son Solomon and charged him to build the house for the Lord God of Israel. And David said to Solomon, my son, as for me, it was in my mind to build a house to the name of the Lord my God, but the word Lord came to me saying, you have shed much blood. And we go on with this. And David had spiritual goals. Building the temple was a spiritual goal, wasn't it? And I think about this as part of David's legacy. As far as David had goals for God that he wasn't going to complete. So what was he making sure would happen? That his children could continue with spiritual goals that he wasn't able to accomplish, right? And I think that may be important for us to think about as we think about this charge. Jump down in verse 11. He said, "Now my son, may the Lord be with you, and you may prosper and build the house of the Lord your God, as he has said to you." Was Solomon prosperous? Absolutely. And when we study, which we're not going to for this, but if we were to study about what the temple would have looked like as far as the way it was furnished and what it would have cost, Solomon, who paid for it? Yeah. David and Solomon. Now we understand they're kings and they collected taxes, but a lot of the money that they had would have come through trade also. Good trade, profitable trade, is a result of good wisdom, right? Prosperity. The more God blessed Solomon, the more Solomon was able to do for God. But the more Solomon did for God, the more God did for Solomon. You see how that works? Okay. And so that's a great thing to think about. Verse 13, he said, "Then you will prosper if you take care to fulfill the statutes and judgments which the Lord charged Moses concerning Israel. Be strong of good courage. Do not fear nor be dismayed." And so in this dispensation between David and Solomon, we see a focus. Last one, we see David telling Solomon, he said, "Show yourself a man and follow God." This one, then he's saying, be faithful to God, be prosperous, so we can get this project finished. David knew he wasn't going to do it. And so he's giving Solomon the tools and instruction to make sure that he could do it. Verse 15, I think, is just interesting, because he said, "Moreover, there are workmen with you in abundance." Everything was laid out for Solomon to do it. And David knew that there was plenty of workmen. Verse 17, I don't have in your notes, and I kind of skipped over it, but I wanted to mention this while we're here. It said, "David also commanded all the leaders of Israel to help Solomon his son." When we talk about the self-appointment of Adonijah, who did he not invite? Just say the leaders of Israel. The ones that would have stopped him from being king and made sure Solomon was going to be king. And so David knew he was going around and making sure that everybody was going to do their part to make sure this happened to help Solomon. All right, we got to get moving here. Some points here that I overlooked. Verse 12. I overlooked verse 12. It says, "Only may the Lord give you wisdom and understanding, and give you a charge concerning Israel, that you may keep the law of the Lord." Where did David know wisdom came from? God. And he's telling Solomon that you need wisdom. And so, if you think about David telling Solomon in some of their conversations, we don't have all of the conversations recorded between Solomon and David. But based upon what we see in 1 Kings and we see here in 1 Chronicles, we see that David wanted to make sure that Solomon was wise enough man to build the temple. And so he gives him instruction, make sure you're wise. God will give you wisdom. And all these, again, are, I believe, groundwork laid for Solomon to make his request. So I got points here from, we already read 1 Kings 2:1-4. Solomon had the throne because his mother and Nathan stepped in. We discussed that, but we can't forget that. David charged his son to step up and lead, which is something that he had not done up to this point. And so point 3 is kind of what we just discussed. These things are leading to where we're headed. Let's go to 1 Chronicles 28. 1 Chronicles 28. And here we're just going to look at verses 9 and 10. He says, as for you, my son Solomon, know the God of your father and serve him with a loyal heart and with a willing mind. For the Lord searches all hearts and understands all the intents of the thoughts. If you seek him, he will be found by you. But if you forsake him, he will cast you off forever. Consider now, for the Lord has chosen you to build the house for the sanctuary. He said, be strong and do it. All right. Solomon, we don't know the exact age when all these discourses are done. But Solomon had a lot of weight put on his shoulders as far as who he needed to be. In our culture today, I think we're far too scared to put too much responsibility on young people. Look at who Solomon became. Why? Because he was expected to do great things. And I think we need to expect far more out of our young people than we do as a whole. I don't know. What do you guys think?
I think kids adapt to their environment that way. If you don't expect anything of them, I think you see that in the jail. Kids who grew up with no expectations, their parents didn't require anything of them.
Yeah.
End up pretty sad on them.
That's the way I agree. That's why I believe. 1 Kings 2, we got about 2 minutes. We're going to pretend this clock behind me is right. So we got 2 minutes. 1 Kings 2, we're going to look at verses 10 and 12, or 10 through 12. It says, so David rested with his fathers, was buried in the city of David. The period that David reigned over Israel was 40 years. 7 years he reigned in Hebron, and in Jerusalem he reigned 33 years. Then Solomon sat on the throne of his father David, and his kingdom was what? Firmly established. Solomon did not leave, or Saul did not leave David a firmly stable and established kingdom. David spent his life, that's one of the reasons he was a man of war, because he was getting things laid to rest so that during Solomon's reign, he didn't have to focus around the distractions around him and protecting the kingdom. He could just build the temple. We're going to look at 1 Kings 3 and verse 3. And then we're going to close, and we'll start with a gift of wisdom. I didn't know where to put this, so we put it with the introduction to the author, because these are attributes of Solomon. So next Wednesday night, Lord willing, we'll continue to look at these. But as we close tonight, in 1 Kings 3 and verse 3, we see, and Solomon loved the Lord, walked in the statutes of his father David, except that he sacrificed and burned incense in the high places. What we see here is from the beginning of Solomon's life to the end of his life, he has stumbling block. And again, the question is that we can't answer is, did this stumbling block cause him to lose his salvation? We don't know. But I believe that Solomon was firmly aware that it was a problem. The question is, what did he do about it? All right, any questions or comments?